from Patterns for Pirates, and I'm going to be sewing up the waistband section of the vintage jumper today. It can be a little tricky or finicky if you have never done a lined waistband with no exposed seams, but once you get it, it's a beautiful finish and you're going to love the end results. So grab your pieces and let's go. Hi guys, I'm here sewing the waistband. And actually I thought I would show a little bit of the waistband piece as I was cutting out my daughter's. There's a few sizes on here because I have to grade sizes for her. And I'm just going to talk about interfacing really quick, even though we have a separate interfacing video if you have lots of questions about it. I'm just going to talk about some of the markings on here. Do not skip marking any of these notches or the little lines. They're all very helpful when you're putting your pieces together. The two marks back here are the strap placement markings. So that's where you're going to align the notch that is on the strap piece. There's one low notch on this side, and that is the center front. So you can align that with the center front of the bib. The markings down here are the side seam right here, so that marks the center. And then the two on the outskirts are where you're going to align it with the edge of the pant. There's some overlap on each side, and that creates where the button and buttonhole overlap above the zipper. So all of these are important. I always cut my notches out like a mountain. And then you can mark your little lines however you like with a little marker just like this is what I usually do. And you can do the same on your pieces. I've already cut my pieces out. And you can just mark right on there. They'll be together, so you really only need to mark one. Like that. And that's going to be tremendously helpful when you're going to sew these up. So this is me, just a little plug. Don't skip all these markings. Hi guys. I'm here with my vintage jumper, almost all sewn up. I have the pants completely sewn up, the pockets are on, outseams, inseams are sewn, my zipper is in, and I also have my bib and straps already. I have my two waistband pieces. Make sure you cut your lining and your main as mirrored images. Here's my lining. I've already pressed up my 1/2 inch there. And I have all my markings, so they have 3 notches on the waistband piece and waistband lining. The two that are close together, this is the back, so these are going to be your straps, where your straps are. I have the center marked, and then I have the center of the front, and you can align your bib there. And then I have the edges marked where you're going to align the edge of your pants to the waistband, because the waistband makes a little tab to have a button and buttonhole. So here's my marking. I did it yellow, I'm not sure if you can see it. So I'm going to align that marking up to the edge of my pants. I'm going to make sure my one notch is on my center front. So on the pants, you can just align it to that center crotch seam. On the skirt, you can fold to find the center. Then I have my next yellow marking, the little dash, and it's going to go on my side seam. I do have mine interfaced here, as you can see. It's a knit interfacing, so my waistband will still have stretch, which is good for comfort. It's a very snug waistband. If you don't use knit interfacing, it's going to feel pretty tight, especially when you try to move around. So repeating the same, that mark is lined up with the zipper. And then I'm just going to put a couple more pins in along the back. Your notches should go kind of at the center of your darts. I'm actually going to put a pin on each dart because I didn't baste these and I want them to be pressed to the side seams. So I'm going to pin them, each dart, over to the side seam so that when I sew them, they'll be pressed the way that I would like. There we go. We're all pinned up. Now I'm just going to sew straight across the top here. I'm going to use a straight stitch. This stretch woven isn't very stretchy, and so I can stretch this fabric to the max that it can stretch, and my straight stitches don't pop. They're just fine. It's really easy to test out your fabric. Grab a little swatch, sew a straight stitch, and then pull it. Just stretch it as far as the fabric will go, and if they pop, you need a stretch stitch. And if they don't, you're fine to use your regular straight stitch. Most stretch wovens won't have enough stretch, but if you're using more like a stable knit, you'll need a stretch stitch because they will stretch more. When you're sewing right here, you should not be sewing on your zipper teeth. You should have that top of that zipper. Let's see if you can see this one a little bit better. You should have this top section of the zipper. Here's where my zipper stop is, and then there is no more teeth up here. So you shouldn't be sewing through teeth right here. That's why we align the very top instead of the zipper stop. So now when we flip this up, the zipper stop will stop really closely to the top. You want to be very, very careful and accurate with your seam allowances on this waistband. If not, it's not going to flip up and look uniform. And also, when you flip the lining down, it might not cover that seam if you're not really accurate with your seam allowances. So take your time, nice and slow, a perfect seam allowance here. I'm going to take this to my iron, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to press the seam allowance up, and then I'm also going to press the waistband up, so everything up, and then we'll be back to do the next step. Okay, I'm back, and I have just pressed my waistband up and seam allowance up. It's really important to get as nice and crisp of a press as you can for these next few steps and for a waistband you're gonna be in love with. Now we're gonna use all these notches on the top. I'm gonna flip that off so maybe we have a little bit better lighting. Here's my notch and the front, and I'm just gonna align my front seam to my bib, to the front seam on my pants, and this notch. They should all be aligned. And what I like to do is I like to pin it, and then I like to flip it up and just double check that it looks like it is straight up. The waistband is small enough that if these aren't perfectly aligned, your eye can really tell. So it's something you want to be super careful about, even if it takes you a few tries. Just getting it just perfect, it's worth being careful there. Okay, I think that's perfect now. And now without stretching, I'm just going to add a few more pins aligning all these raw edges with my bib and my main waistband piece. The edges come out to about the pockets here on all sizes, youth and adult. Make sure that when you flip it up, they're both coming out to about the same spot. They should both come out to about the pocket, right? It's just something with a stretch woven. You might find yourself stretching a tiny bit, any piece, easing it in a little bit, excuse me. And so it's always good just to double check that when you flip it up, they look nice and even. Should just kind of continue from that pocket, and this should be straight up here. It's looking good. That's ready to baste on. I'm gonna move to my back. So here's my darts. The adult has darts, the youth does not. They don't have such a curvy difference between their full hip and their waist as the adult. And so they didn't really need the darts. All right, I have my straps here. Okay. And once you've sewn them up, it makes it a little easier if you clip off this little seam allowance right here. So that way you can see your notch a little bit better. And you can really see that angle. Okay. Just going to do the same on this one. Clip off that seam allowance. Okay. I'm going to put them right sides down. It's important if you have a right and wrong side. I use the same fabric, but my top thread matched a little bit better than my bobbin thread. So it's important to me that I have the top thread as the main side. So make sure they're right sides down, and your angle needs to go down. They should make a V. So they should go down towards the center. This makes them crisscross a little bit nicer. So they should crisscross even now towards the center once you put them on, if the angles are correct. So again, they should make a V. They should angle towards the center. And when you flip them up, they will still angle towards the center. And that just helps them cross over your shoulders nicely. Versus a straight rectangle. So again, they should want to cross like this. And that's exactly what we want. So make sure they're not angled the other way. And I'm just going to baste all of these on with a long straight stitch. I usually baste it on about 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. You can do a basting stitch inside and outside and remove one. That is especially nice if your fabric is slippery. Maybe you're using like a velvet or another fabric that's kind of trickier to work with. If you are, go ahead and do one at 1/4 of an inch, and then again at 5/8 or even 3/4. Then you'll be sure that your bib doesn't move as you're making those final stitches on your waistband. And when you flip it up, you know, the sides of your bib will be even with the pockets, even with each other, you know, equidistant from the center, and your center seams will be aligned perfectly. This fabric that I'm working with isn't very difficult to work with, in my opinion. It doesn't want to move around very much. It actually is the opposite, where it kind of sticks to itself, you know, because it's suede. It's kind of got that texture. It kind of will stick to itself. So I'm not going to take the extra step to do a double baste. I am going to lift up my bib one last time and make sure that I'm happy with the way these are aligning with the pockets. The bib edge is aligning with the pockets, and my center seam is lining up nicely. It's really important to me, so I'm kind of meticulous about that. Alright, I'm going to fold it back down. I'm going to turn this off again, so hopefully we have a little bit better lighting. And I'm going to grab my lining piece. Now, if you were careful to cut 2 mirror pieces, these should fit on perfectly. If you're using the same fabric like me, you really have to pay attention. Not when you're cutting out, because you can just fold it in half and cut it like you always do. But when you're putting your interfacing on, you really want to be careful that you're interfacing them to mirror. And then when you press this up, you really want to make sure that you're pressing your lining piece versus your main piece, so that the fronts are going to align for you, or all your notches are going to align. If you accidentally do it wrong, it's not that big of a deal. You just won't have notches to help you align along the way. So right here, we're going to sew this seam right here. So even though I've pressed this up, I'm going to press it down. And because it has that zipper, it's pretty thick. Really got to make sure that you get it just so. And I'm going to put my pin right next to that marking. And that's where I'm going to start to sew, is right on that marking. Should be right on the edge. You don't want to start back here or your tab won't flip out beautifully. You want to start right on the edge here, and we're just going to go up and around when we sew. So I'm just going to continue to pin this, lining up all my notches and markings to my other waistband. They're the exact same piece, so they should align perfectly for you. Here's my other marking. I'm actually going to go all the way to this end and go ahead and do it. I am in a habit of always doing either the top and the bottom. Again, I'm going to press this down. Both my seams are down, even though they've both been pressed up. There's a crease right there that will show you where your seam allowance is perfectly that you want to sew on. But you're going to press both your seam allowances down while you sew that area. I'm in a huge habit of going to the front and the back, or top and bottom, and pinning, and then pinning through the middle. I think it's much easier. I think you catch yourself sometimes wanting to ease things in or stretch them slightly. So I always start at the front and back, or top and bottom. My basting stitch didn't clip right there. And you just want to pin as much as you need to feel comfortable. I'm doing an adult size, so I'll have quite a few pins here since they're bigger pieces than if you're doing a smaller youth size. Okay, I'm all pinned up. I'm going to flip this back on. I'm going to start at an end. And, oh, I'm sorry, I bumped you. And just like I said, I'm going to start right at this yellow marking that I marked from my pattern piece and that I aligned to the edge of my pant or skirt. I'm doing the capris here, the capri pants. Don't start before this. You want to start right on the edge. If you didn't align them perfectly, you're going to want to start on the edge, not on the marking. Hopefully you aligned it perfectly. You really want to make sure that bottom is flipped up. Sometimes it's a real stinker about wanting to flip down because it's already been pressed up, so it wants to stay up. And because the zipper is so sturdy, it really doesn't want to listen a lot of times. My machine came... Oh, you know what? I have a dark thread in here, and I'm going to switch it real quick. Okay, so making sure both my seam allowances are down. Slide it under there. And I'm going to start right at the edge. Right where that marking is on the pattern piece that you align to the edge. It's really nice to give yourself those markings so you're not just trying to feel around for the edge. It's a lot more accurate and easy. So don't skip the notches, don't skip the markings. I promise taking the time to mark them and cut them is well worth it when you're sewing the waistband. Again, you're going to be super accurate and careful with your seam allowances here. If you're sewing a youth, sometimes I like to backstitch right here on the edges of the bib and the straps. This is an adult, so I'm not worried about it because I'm going to be putting it on and off myself, and I'm not a rough little preschooler who rips it on and off. But for my daughter, I will often backstitch there just to make it even more secure, because she does tend to be really rough with her clothes when she's getting them on and off, and I never want that higher stress area to come undone. There. If you're a beginner and you struggle knowing exactly where to stop and pivot around these corners to get a perfect square, it does not take very long to just mark your 5/8 seam allowances here with the same pen or marker that you used marking these. Just go ahead and continue marking that 1/2 inch all the way around right here. You can go along the whole waistband if you want, but if you have a hard time knowing when to stop and pivot, drawing yourself a little seam allowance, that's what my mom used to do when we were learning how to sew, and what she still does when the grandkids are learning to sew now is she'll just draw on the seam allowances for them to follow along with their needle, and it makes it so much easier to know exactly where you want to turn. Once you've been sewing quite a while, and especially if you're used to the same seam allowances, all my patterns, most of my patterns have a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and so I'm really good at eyeballing that 1/2 inch right here, but it takes a long time to get that, and marking it with a marker is so simple and quick and easy to give yourself that perfect corners. All I'm doing now is trimming my corners. I do usually trim off all my notches as well. I do not trim my seam allowances here. You can trim them down if you want to. I do not. There's plenty of space in my waistband for the seam allowances. If you see right here, it's got a 1/2 inch here, and then it's got a 1/2 inch here, and there's actually some wiggle room. It's about 1/4 inch. On the youth, there's no wiggle room, so the 1/2 inch seam allowances fill up the waistband, and I kind of like that look. I like that it kind of looks more, it's almost like amplifies the interfacing. It makes it look really stable, and I prefer that look. But you can trim these down. I only trim the corners, so what I do is I come in here at an angle. Do not clip through your seam allowance, just right next to it. And then I like to trim this corner one down 1/2 inch. I think it helps keep the corners less bulky. So if I just went like this and did that, which you can do, this is going to flip in, and this is going to flip in. And you can see they kind of overlap here. And so I just like to trim this one down to about 1/4 inch. You don't want to get too tight. Don't trim under 1/4 inch anywhere. And so then when it goes in, it's just got a little more wiggle room there. Not to be too bulky. Okay. I'm going to use my tube turner because my little ones ran off with my bamboo stick, which is what I actually normally use to do this. But this works okay. They really like that. My son really likes that bamboo stick. It kind of looks like a tiny sword almost, and he just can't resist it. So there you go. It turns out nice and beautifully. Little square. As you flip it down, what's going to happen is this seam will cover your first seam, and it's just going to be a beautiful inside and outside waistband right here. So first we're just going to flip it all up, and I will take it to my iron and press everything, and then I'll come back and show you how I pin everything in place, and we're almost done. Almost done. This waistband does take some pinning, some prep work with the interfacing, things like that, but it gives you such a nice, beautiful inside and outside. It's really worth it. And as you can see, it's just a beautiful little button tab. No seams on the inside. Alright, I'm going to take this to the iron, and I'm just going to press everything. I'm going to repress this seam. I'm going to press this seam. I'm going to come in from the front and press it. I'm going to come in from the back and press it. Press until you think it looks nice and beautiful. Okay, I'm back. I've pressed from the front. I've pressed from the back. I think everything looks good. I like to sew my waistband from the front side because I care most about what the front side looks like. Some people, when sewing this method, like to sew from the back side, and that's okay too, whatever you're most comfortable with. So what I like to do is pin from the front side, and I just check the back side, make sure it's nice and beautiful and covering my seam, and then put the pin in, check one more time, and continue like that all down the waist pants. I'm going to do that real fast. Now we're all pinned up, looking good from the front and the back. I have quite a few pins so that once I remove one, I don't have very long before I have another pin holding everything in place. You can really start anywhere you want on your waistband. I almost always start here at the bottom edge. Again, I like to sew from the right side of the garment, but you can sew from the back side, whatever you prefer. Again, I'm just using a straight stitch because my fabric does not have that much stretch that it will pop, even when it stretches as much as it can. I like to top stitch about an 1/8 inch away. And I'm just going to go down the bottom. When I go down the bottom, it's going to completely sew up my waistband. Some people do like to, instead of pinning like I did, some people like to use like a glue stick or stay tape, something like that to hold it in place. I have used stay tape before, but in the end, pinning has always been fine for me, so that's usually what I do. If you're pinning and you're having a really hard time keeping the underside looking really nicely, try stay tape. Might help you keep everything nice and neat on the underside. And I'm just going to keep going. I'm going to hit this corner, go up and around. You always want to pivot with your needle down so that you don't lose where your stitch is. So needle down, foot up, pivot, foot down, and then keep on going. Okay, home stretch. And we're done. Just gonna trim my threads. And here's the inside. And here's the outside. And as you can see, my seam allowance almost fills up the whole thing. I don't trim it. I like the kind of thicker look. There you go. It's a really nice finish. And if you take your time pressing and pinning, it's not a tricky sew, it's really just a rectangle. You just have to take that time, press, press, press from the front, press from the back, take your time pinning, getting it just so, go nice and slow on your top stitch, and you'll have a beautiful waistband. I can't wait to see yours. Make sure you share it with us so we can congratulate you on your beautiful waistband.